Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of like absolute precision. It's almost like structural engineering.
Right, yeah.
You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line against the black background, and the doctor just points and says, there it is, there's the problem.
It's comforting, honestly, because it's so binary. I mean, a bone is either broken or it's not. The intervention is obvious.
Exactly. We really crave that kind of visibility. We want our problems neatly categorized. But the moment you step out of the physical realm and into the world of human conflict or sociology or collective psychology, that X-ray machine is just completely useless.
Oh, absolutely.
We're suddenly looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky. I mean, pinpointing the exact origin of a conflict or the exact moment a society fractures, it becomes this massive investigative challenge.
It is the definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Yeah.
And that murky landscape is exactly what we are navigating today in this deep dive.
Yeah, and it is a fascinating piece of text we've got.
It really is. We are looking at a very specific, highly dense excerpt from a document called the Peaceful World Manifesto, version 1.0.
Right.
Out of this entire expansive blueprint for global stability, we're zeroing in exclusively on point 13. It's titled The Right to Truth, with a little parenthetical addition that says Information Ecology.
And the final line of this paragraph, the thesis statement that everything builds toward, is one of the most chilling diagnostic statements I've read in a long time.
Yeah, it really sticks with you.
It simply says, dehumanization always precedes the gunshot.
Such a heavy phrase.
It is. And our mission for this deep dive is to basically reverse engineer this single paragraph with you, the listener, to understand how to stop that metaphorical and literal gunshot.
Right, because the text introduces this completely radical framework for how information, language, and technology interact with human conflict.
We're going to unpack the mechanics of concepts like epistemic hygiene, pre-bunking, and value alignment just to see how they all fit together.
But, before we dive into those mechanics, it's really worth laying down a baseline for our approach today.
Good point.
Whenever we discuss media, truth, and conflict, the conversation can naturally drift into highly polarized political territory. So, to be completely transparent with you, the listener, we are exploring these concepts objectively.
Exactly. No sides being taken here.
None at all. We are strictly analyzing the mechanics of the text provided. We aren't endorsing a political faction, nor are we taking sides on current events. We're acting purely as your guides to convey the underlying logic of the blueprint this text is built.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The very first sentence of point 13 does not pull its punches. It says, war feeds on lies.
Yeah, it jumps right in.
From there, it immediately categorizes hate speech, dehumanization, and the manipulation of facts as forms of information violence. Which, they fundamentally shifts how we talk about toxic internet culture.
It really does. It's no longer just, bad behavior. It's framed as a violent act.
Yeah.
And that phrasing, war feeds on lies, it's doing a tremendous amount of conceptual work right out of the gate. It establishes a biological metaphor.
How so?
Well, violence in this framework isn't an earthquake. It isn't a spontaneous, unpredictable eruption of tectonic plates. It is an organism.
Oh, I see.
And like any organism, it requires a steady, specific diet to sustain itself, to grow, and to eventually act. That sustenance is lies.
So without that constant caloric intake of manipulated facts, the organism of war just starves.
Precisely.
And that biological framing makes the next term they use, information ecology, click perfectly into place. Ecology is a word we usually reserve for rainforests or river basins, coral reefs.
Right, physical environments.
Yeah. It describes a delicate, deeply interconnected environment where every organism affects the whole.
And applying that to our digital and informational lives implies that our shared reality is just as delicate and interdependent as a river system.
That's a scary thought.
It is. Because in a physical ecosystem, if an industrial plant dumps a heavy metal toxin into the soil, the damage doesn't stay contained to that one patch of dirt.
No, of course not. The grass absorbs the heavy metal.
Exactly. The local herbivores eat the grass. The apex predators eat the herbivores. The toxin bioaccumulates as it moves up the food chain, becoming more concentrated and deadly.
And the text is arguing that our collective mental environment operates using those exact same principles of bioaccumulation.
Yes. If one corner of the internet is deeply polluted with manipulated facts and dehumanizing rhetoric, it eventually bleeds into the broader cultural consciousness. the whole system degrades.
I'm really thinking about the implications of that phrase, information violence, because that is a massive escalation in our vocabulary.
It is a huge leap.
Right. If we look at physical violence, society has incredibly clear parameters and laws. If someone walks up and strikes another person, that's physical assault. If someone poisons a city's water reservoir, that is a catastrophic act of terror or war. By elevating the manipulation of facts to information violence, this text is arguing that poisoning the information supply is the exact same level of aggression as poisoning a physical water supply.
That is the core argument of their premise.
Yeah.
They are deliberately eroding the barrier we usually place between physical harm and informational harm.
It's treating them as equals.
Exactly. When an entity engages in the systematic manipulation of facts or the spread of dehumanizing narratives, they aren't just expressing a controversial opinion.
Right.
They are committing an act of violence against the shared ecosystem. They are poisoning the well from which society has to drink to make democratic collective decisions.
So for you, the listener, think about how this manifests in your own daily routine. Consider the act of doom scrolling.
Oh, we've all been there.
Right. You're sitting on your couch after a long day, flitching your thumb up a glass screen, and after 20 minutes, you start to feel a physical reaction.
Yeah, the tightness in your chest.
Exactly. An ambient exhaustion, a low-grade, simmering anxiety and outrage. Under the framework of point 13, you aren't just, spending too much time on your phone.
No.
You are existing in a deeply polluted information ecology. You are actively breathing in cognitive smog, and your nervous system is reacting to the toxins.
And if we accept that the environment is polluted and that this pollution constitutes a form of violence against the individual, well, the natural consequence is that the individual requires a defense mechanism.
Like a shield.
Right. Yeah. Which leads to the text assertion of a brand new fundamental human right, the right to cognitive security.
The right to cognitive security. It's a really profound concept. We take the right to physical security as a given in any functioning society.
Sure.
The text suggests that your mind, your attention span, and your baseline perception of reality have an equal right to be protected from hostile manipulation.
It expands the definition of bodily autonomy to include the mind's operating system.
But I have to push back here for a second.
Go for it.
Because cognitive security sounds incredibly noble in theory, but in practice, how is that different from an individual simply building an impenetrable echo chamber?
That's the big question.
Right, because I can easily imagine someone saying, I have a fundamental right to my cognitive security, therefore I'm going to completely block out anyone who disagrees with my political views because their differing perspective threatens my psychological safety.
Yeah, people can definitely twist it that way.
Doesn't establishing this right just give people intellectual permission to build thicker walls around their existing biases?
That is the most common and honestly dangerous pitfall when dealing with this concept. And it's vital to make the distinction the text is drawing here.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Cognitive security, in this framework, is not about blocking out different or uncomfortable opinions. It is strictly about being shielded from the manipulation of facts and the specific tactic of dehumanization.
So it is entirely about the mechanism being used, not the ideological message being delivered.
Precisely. To use a technological analogy, think of your mind as a computer operating system.
Okay.
Cognitive security is not a firewall configured to block software programs that you just happen to dislike or find annoying. It is a baseline antivirus program designed exclusively to block malware.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Disagreeing with a neighbor about, say, tax policy or healthcare infrastructure or zoning laws, that is a healthy, necessary feature of a robust ecosystem. That is two different software programs interacting.
Right. That's just normal discourse.
But a coordinated, algorithmically amplified campaign using deepfakes and fabricated statistics to convince you that a specific demographic of human beings are subhuman parasites.
Yeah.
That is malware. That is a direct attack on your cognitive security because its explicit goal is to exploit your psychological vulnerabilities, bypass your rational faculties, and corrupt your baseline perception of reality.
That distinction makes complete sense. It's about the structural integrity of the mind's operating system. Imagine what a society would actually look like if cognitive security was treated with the same legal and cultural reverence as physical safety.
It would change everything.
Right. If a multinational tech corporation knew they were legally liable for breaching the cognitive security of their users by deliberately fixing them outrage-inducing algorithmic loops that distorted their reality. I mean, the entire architecture of the modern internet would have to be dismantled and rebuilt from scratch.
And the text is fully aware that demanding a paradigm shift of that magnitude requires more than just philosophical declarations.
Yeah, you need practical steps.
Right. It requires daily, actionable practices. So, to achieve this state of security, Point 13 introduces a highly specific three-part methodology. It functions as a sort of trinity of mental cleanliness.
The Trinity. I like that framing. The three pillars are epistemic hygiene, semantic hygiene, and collective sense-making.
Let's break these down.
Yeah, let's start with epistemic hygiene, because this is where the text moves from high-level philosophy to the gritty reality of how we actually process information every day.
Yeah. So, epistemology is a branch of philosophy concerned with the theory of knowledge. It asks fundamental questions. How do we know what we know? What justifies our beliefs?
Okay.
So epistemic hygiene is the rigorous daily practice of cleaning up the process by which we acquire knowledge.
Like fact-checking.
Yes, but even deeper. In an era of unlimited information, are we actively verifying the primary sources of the claims we read? Are we relying on empirical cross-referenced evidence?
Or are we just reacting?
Exactly. Or are we passively accepting a claim because it feels true, because it aligns with our pre-existing tribal anger, or simply because we've seen it repeated so many times that our brain mistakes familiarity for truth?
The psychological phenomenon of the illusory truth effect.
Yes, exactly.
Where repeating a lie often enough makes it feel true because it becomes easier for the brain to process.
It's a biological vulnerability.
So epistemic hygiene is the deliberate effort to fight that biological laziness. It's cognitive hand-washing.
I love that analogy.
Right. You wouldn't let a surgeon operate on you if they hadn't scrubbed their hands, yet we routinely make massive society-altering judgments using unverified, dirty information inputs.
And just as poor physical hygiene leads to disease spreading through a population, core epistemic hygiene allows misinformation to become endemic.
So I was thinking about the second pillar, semantic hygiene, earlier, and it struck me that if epistemic hygiene is washing your hands before you step into the kitchen to cook, making sure your inputs are fundamentally clean, then semantic hygiene is ensuring that the labels on the ingredients in the pantry are actually accurate.
Oh, that is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. Language is the ingredient of thought.
Exactly. If someone sneaks into the kitchen and swaps the labels on the sugar and the salt, it doesn't matter how meticulously clean your hands are, the recipe is going to be a disaster.
A total mess.
Right. Semantics is the study of meaning in language. So semantic hygiene is the active defense against the corruption of words. In a polluted information ecology, words are the first things to get weaponized.
Yes, their definitions are stretched, hollowed out, or just completely inverted to serve a narrative.
We see this constantly. When semantic hygiene breaks down, a word like freedom can be twisted to mean the subjugation of others.
Or a word like aggression is redefined as preemptive defense.
Exactly.
The text recognizes that language directly shapes the boundaries of what a society considers acceptable action. If you can degrade the semantic hygiene of a population, you can drastically alter their reality.
You can't even hold a meaningful democratic debate anymore because the two sides are operating with entirely different dictionaries.
Which explains why the text ties the breakdown of semantic hygiene directly to the manipulation of facts.
Right.
If I can change the fundamental definition of the words we use to describe an event, I can change the fact of the event without ever having to alter the physical reality of what happened.
It is an incredibly efficient, low-cost form of cognitive pollution.
And that profound vulnerability brings us to the third and perhaps most vital pillar of the Trinity collective sense-making.
The word collective is doing a tremendous amount of heavy lifting there.
Because it acknowledges a hard truth about human psychology and sociology. You cannot maintain a clean information ecology in isolation.
No, it's impossible.
You can be the most epistemically hygienic individual on the planet. You can meticulously verify every fact, track down every primary source, and fiercely protect the definitions of your words. But if you are living in a society that has entirely abandoned those practices, your individual hygiene will not insulate you from the systemic consequences of their actions.
Returning to our kitchen analogy, collective sense-making is the requirement that the entire kitchen staff agrees on the recipe.
Right. They communicate clearly using the same labels, and they work in tandem.
It's the establishment of a shared reality protocol. It's an acknowledgement that truth, And a functioning society isn't just an individual philosophical pursuit. It is a collaborative, constantly negotiated social project.
Yes.
If we don't make sense of the world collectively, we fracture into completely isolated, mutually hostile realities.
But recognizing the necessity of this trinity is only half the battle. Theory is wonderful, but how do you operationalize it?
Right. How does an average citizen actually scrub the ecosystem clean on a practical Tuesday afternoon level?
That's the pivot the text makes next. It provides a tactical toolkit. And the two primary tools it outlines for maintaining this ecology are OSINT and pre-bunking.
Let's look at OSINT first, open source intelligence. For you listening, if you haven't tumbled down this particular rabbit hole of the internet, what exactly are we talking about here?
Well, historically, the concept of intelligence gathering was the exclusive domain of state actors.
Spies, classified satellites, clandestine intercepts.
Exactly. But OSINT represents the total democratization of intelligence. It relies entirely on the unimaginably massive ocean of publicly available information.
Things anyone can access.
Yes, we are talking about commercially available, high-resolution satellite imagery, public shipping databases, social media posts, live flight trackers, street-level mapping data. The Manifesto elevates OSINT as the premier tool for verifying reality.
So OSINT is the physical manifestation of collective sense-making in the digital age.
It is the ultimate expression of it. You no longer need a security clearance to verify if a government or a media outlet is lying to you.
Can you give an example of how that works in practice?
Sure. Let's say a video goes viral, claiming to show a violent military crackdown in a specific city on a specific day. In the past, the public would have to rely on official statements to confirm or deny it.
Which could be biased.
Exactly. Today, a decentralized collective network of citizens can engage in OSINT. They look at the shadows cast by the buildings in the video and use chronolocation to determine the exact time of day.
Oh, wow. Using the shadows.
Yeah. They look at the weather patterns, the specific type of foliage, the language on the street signs. They cross-reference all of that with historical weather data and Google Street View.
And within hours, they can collectively prove that the video wasn't shot yesterday. It was shot 4 years ago in an entirely different hemisphere.
Precisely. It is open source, peer-reviewed truth verification.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. The second tool in the kit. The text introduces the concept of pre-bunking, and it explicitly uses the metaphor of information vaccination.
A very powerful metaphor.
I'm fascinated by this concept because it addresses the sheer speed at which lies travel today.
And speed is the primary problem with the traditional model of truth-seeking, which is debunking.
Right.
The old model goes like this: a malicious actor tells a lie. The lie goes viral, amplified by algorithms. It spreads rapidly through the ecosystem. Then hours or days later, fact-checkers and journalists run after it, publishing detailed articles correcting the record.
But by the time the correction is published, the damage is already done. The lie has already been integrated into the worldview of millions of people.
There's an old adage that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting its shoes on.
And cognitive science explains exactly why debunking is so incredibly difficult, right?
Yes. Once a piece of misinformation takes root in a person's mind and aligns with their identity, trying to correct it with facts often triggers the backfire effect.
Let's drill down into the mechanism of the backfire effect. Why does our brain do that?
When you challenge a deeply held belief, even with irrefutable evidence, the human brain perceives that ideological challenge as a literal physical threat.
Wow.
The amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for the fight or flight response, lights up. The person doesn't process the new information logically, they process it defensively.
Just dig their heels in.
They double down on the false belief to protect their sense of identity. Debunking often fails because it triggers the amygdala. That is why the Manifesto advocates so strongly for pre-bunking.
So how does the mechanism of an information vaccination actually bypass that biological defense system? Walk us through how a pre-bunking campaign functions in the real world.
It works exactly like a biological vaccine. A medical vaccine exposes your immune system to a weakened, deactivated, or harmless fragment of a virus. Your body studies it, learns its shape, and builds antibodies without ever getting sick. When the real live virus enters your body months later, your immune system instantly recognizes it and neutralizes it before it can replicate.
So how does that apply to information?
Pre-bunking exposes people to the mechanisms and tactics of manipulation in a low-stakes, neutral environment before they ever encounter the emotionally charged weaponized lie.
You aren't fact-checking a specific political story. You are exposing the psychological trick itself.
Correct. You focus on the structure of the malware. For example, a pre-bunking campaign might consist of a short, engaging, politically neutral video that explains a common manipulation tactic called the false dichotomy.
Right.
The video would explain, manipulators love to present you with only two extreme catastrophic options to solve a problem, ignoring all nuance to force you into a state of panic.
You give them a ridiculous, harmless example, like, you either have to eat nothing but raw broccoli for the rest of your life, or you will suffer a massive heart attack tomorrow.
Exactly. By exposing the tactic using an absurd example, you allow the person's rational brain to understand the manipulation without triggering their amygdala.
Because their identity isn't threatened by broccoli.
Exactly. You have just built a cognitive antibody. A week later, when that same person is scrolling through their feed and encounters a highly sophisticated, emotionally charged political advertisement that uses the exact same false dichotomy structure, their brain patterns recognize it.
The cognitive immune system kicks in.
They think, I see what you're doing. You're trying to force me into a panic using a false choice. The manipulation fails completely. The virus cannot take root.
That is incredibly empowering. It shifts the individual from being a passive consumer of information to an active defender of their own cognitive security.
It really does.
And for you listening right now, consider how often you likely engage in amateur OSINT, or self-pre-bunking, without even realizing it. Have you ever received a highly urgent, suspicious email claiming your bank account is locked, and instead of clicking the link, you manually inspect the sender's email address to see if it's a string of random numbers?
Or have you ever seen a bizarre, too-perfect photo of a politician on social media and immediately looked at the hands to see if an AI generated 6 fingers?
Exactly. That instinct is epistemic hygiene. You are actively contributing to the health of the information ecology.
But the text is also deeply pragmatic. It understands that while individual hygiene is necessary, it is not sufficient.
Right, we can't do it all ourselves.
You cannot place the entire burden of maintaining a clean global ecology on the shoulders of exhausted citizens doing reverse image searches in their free time. The massive institutions that manufacture and distribute our information must also fundamentally change their operating models.
Which forces us to look at the role of the media. And Point 13 does not spare traditional journalism. It demands the implementation of what it defines as peace journalism standards, directly contrasting this with what it calls the propaganda of violence.
That phrase, propaganda of violence, is a stinging critique of how traditional conflict reporting operates.
Yeah.
Think about the mechanics of how war is presented on rolling news networks. It is often structured, visually and narratively, like a grotesque, high-stakes sporting event.
The focus is overwhelmingly kinetic. It's all about the action. Where did the missiles land? Which faction took which neighborhood? What is the estimated body count today? It's a scoreboard mentality.
And while those kinetic events are factually happening, presenting them in isolation without context is what the text labels propaganda.
Why is that?
Because of the attention economy. The absolute necessity for news networks to keep viewers glued to the screen through commercial breaks. Traditional journalism relies heavily on the if it bleeds, it leads mechanism. It exploits the human nervous system's hardwired compulsion to stare at threats. By constantly prioritizing the spectacular visuals of violence, traditional reporting inadvertently normalizes the violence. It makes the conflict seem like a permanent, inevitable state of nature rather than a man-made failure of diplomacy.
So what does peace journalism do differently? I mean, how do you report on a war without showing the war?
The text states that peace journalism shifts the camera angle entirely. Instead of focusing solely on the kinetic violence, it demands an intense, rigorous focus on the solutions and the causes of the conflict.
Now, I can hear the objections to this concept already.
Oh, I'm sure.
Because peace journalism sounds, at first glance, dangerously close to toxic positivity. If a news organization only focuses on peace initiatives and ignores the bombings, doesn't it run the risk of becoming horribly naive? Or worse, doesn't it provide cover for aggressors and dictators by refusing to broadcast the brutal reality of their actions?
That is the standard defense of traditional journalism, and it's a very valid concern. But a close reading of the text reveals that peace journalism does not mean ignoring brutality. It hinges on the word causes. The text demands a focus on solutions and the root causes of the conflict.
Ah, okay. So it's the difference between systems thinking and event thinking.
Exactly. Tallying up a daily body count is intellectually speaking, a very shallow form of journalism. It requires very little systemic analysis.
Right.
Peace journalism demands that reporters dig beneath the kinetic events to expose the structural foundations of the violence. What are the historical traumas being weaponized by the leaders? What are the economic deprivations forcing populations into extremism? How are the local supply chains of weapons being funded by international actors?
So instead of just parking a camera in front of a burning building, the journalist investigates the political rhetoric that primed the public to accept the bombing of that building and the financial incentives of the companies manufacturing the explosive.
Yes.
You treat the physical violence not as the entirety of the story, but as the tragic, inevitable symptom of a much deeper systemic corruption.
And by simultaneously highlighting structural solutions, by reporting on where grassroots community negotiations are succeeding, or where local groups are successfully resisting dehumanization campaigns, you break the psychological spell of inevitability.
You prove to the public that the violence is a choice and that other choices exist.
Right. It is a far more rigorous, demanding form of truth-telling than simply pointing a lens at an explosion.
So what does this all mean for the modern era? We can demand new standards from human journalists, but let's be fiercely realistic about how information is consumed today. For the vast majority of the global population, the primary editor of their daily reality is not a human being sitting at a desk in a newsroom.
No, it's not.
The editor is code.
Which brings us to the machine layer. The text tackles this head-on. It recognizes that algorithms are the invisible infrastructure of the information ecology.
And it has demands for them, too.
Point 13 lists 4 non-negotiable demands regarding artificial intelligence and algorithmic curation: explainability, value alignment, transparency, and independent audits.
Let's translate these highly technical computer science concepts into the philosophical framework we've been building. If an algorithm is managing the ecosystem, how do these 4 demands clean it up? Let's start with explainability and transparency.
Right now, when you open a social media app, an incredibly complex machine learning model decides what specific sequence of posts, videos, and articles you will see. It is actively managing your cognitive diet.
Yeah.
But these algorithms are black boxes. They're so dense, operating on millions of parameters, that often even the engineers who wrote the original code cannot explain exactly why the AI chose to show you video A instead of video B.
And if we connect this to the broader picture, a black box is a profound existential threat to cognitive security. If an individual cannot know why they are being shown a specific piece of content, it is impossible for them to assess if they are being manipulated. If an algorithm decides to subtly suppress voices of moderate reconciliation and aggressively amplify voices of tribal outrage, and the public cannot see the underlying code to prove it, we are entirely defenseless.
Right.
Explainability means the system must be engineered to justify its curatorial choices in a language and logic that human beings can audit and understand.
Which leads directly into the concept of value alignment. This is arguably the most critical battleground in the AI space today.
Let's unpack the mechanism of value alignment because it explains so much of our current cultural anxiety. How are algorithms aligned right now?
Currently, the vast majority of commercial algorithms have a very simple mathematical objective function. They are aligned with one primary metric engagement.
They just want you to stay.
They are designed to maximize the amount of time a user's eyes are locked onto the screen, because time on screen equals ad revenue.
And human neurobiology dictates what keeps our eyes on the screen.
Exactly. The AI doesn't know what a word means. It doesn't know what hate speech or peace means. It only knows that when it presents a specific configuration of pixels and text that induces the state of high emotional arousal, specifically outrage, fear, or moral disgust, the human user stops scrolling and stays on the platform 400% longer.
He's just doing math.
The AI learns through reinforcement that outrage equals success. So mathematically optimizing an AI purely for engagement is functionally identical to optimizing it to promote the exact information violence the Manifesto warns against. The machine isn't malicious. It is just ruthlessly, perfectly efficient at exploiting human biology.
I keep coming back to an industrial analogy. Imagine an algorithm without value alignment is like a highly automated, hyper-efficient factory.
Okay.
The factory's only programmed goal is to produce as many widgets as possible at the lowest possible cost. To achieve that efficiency, the factory pumps its toxic chemical byproduct directly into the river that runs through the center of the town. The factory is succeeding wildly at its metric. Widget production is through the roof, but the ecosystem of the town is dying. The people are drinking poisoned water.
That's spot on. Value alignment means intervening at the foundational code level of the factory. It means forcing the AI to align with the values of a healthy information ecology. You have to reprogram the objective function so that the machine measures success not just by how many minutes did the user scroll, but by metrics that promote truth, peace, and security.
But you can't just trust the factory owner to self-report how much toxic waste they are dumping. History shows us that corporations rarely prioritize the ecosystem over their own efficiency.
And that is exactly why the text demands the final piece of the puzzle: independent audits of AI systems.
The environmental inspector.
Yes, you need an independent, scientifically rigorous body that has the legal authority to open the black box, analyze the AI's weightings, measure the amount of cognitive pollution it is actively generating, and mandate code adjustments if the algorithm is violating the public's right to cognitive security.
Whoever controls the algorithms controls the diet of the organism.
If war feeds on lies, the algorithms are the automated supply chain delivering those lies to the front lines. We have to audit the supply chain.
I want everyone listening to do a quick practical exercise. Next time you open your primary social media feed, stop and look at the first 5 posts the algorithm serves you. Ask yourself, can I explain the mechanism here? What specific psychological button is this code trying to press in my brain?
Is it trying to make me afraid?
Right. Is it trying to make me feel morally superior to a specific group? If you can't answer why the machine put that information in front of you, you are experiencing a total lack of algorithmic transparency. You are swimming in an ecology you do not understand, and you are vulnerable.
Recognizing that vulnerability is crucial because all of these concepts we've spent the last hour dissecting: the epistemic hygiene, the OSINT verification, the pre-bunking inoculations, the systemic shift to peace journalism, the independent auditing of AI. None of these are just, abstract academic exercises.
They're not.
They are heavy, desperate defensive mechanisms. They are an interconnected architecture designed for one singular purpose: to prevent a specific, catastrophic end state.
Which brings us back to the hook, the final devastating sentence of point 13, the culmination of the entire framework. Dehumanization always precedes the gunshot.
What is truly remarkable about this single sentence is how it functions as a diagnostic timeline. It maps the linear progression of violence.
What do you mean?
The text is explicitly stating that the physical act of war, the pulling of the trigger, the dropping of the bomb, is never the first step in a conflict. It is the very last step. It is the final, tragic symptom of an infection that began long before.
Let's trace that infection from the beginning, building the sequence based on everything we've unpacked today. How does a society get from a clean ecology to the gunshot?
It begins with a subtle failure of epistemic hygiene. A population becomes overwhelmed or lazy, and they stop demanding verification. They start accepting information based on tribal affiliation rather than evidence.
Okay, so the immune system drops.
Yes. This creates vulnerabilities in the cognitive immune system, allowing lies and manipulated facts to enter the ecosystem.
Once the lies are in the system, semantic hygiene begins to collapse. The language is actively corrupted.
Yes. The manipulators begin twisting words. The definitions of justice, defense, and threat are altered to serve a narrative. Then algorithms lacking value alignment take those twisted narratives and amplify them exponentially.
Pushing them to the top of everyone's feeds because the outrage generates massive engagement.
The pollution bioaccumulates.
It reaches a critical mass.
And the ecosystem is saturated with information violence. This environment naturally breeds the final, necessary psychological tactic: dehumanization.
The systematic, relentless campaign to convince a population that their neighbors or a specific minority group or a rival nation are not fully human.
Exactly. They're categorized using semantic hygiene failures as a disease, an infestation, a biological threat.
And this is where the psychology of conflict is so vital to understand. Human beings have a deep biological resistance to intraspecies violence. In a healthy state, you cannot convince a regular person to simply walk out their front door and shoot another human being. The psychological toll is just too massive.
Exactly. You have to break their psychological safeguards first. You have to corrupt their cognitive operating system. If you convince a person that the target is not human, you bypass the biological resistance to killing.
Wow.
Dehumanization is the malicious software update that allows the physical hardware, the gun, the drone, the artillery, to be fired without the soldier experiencing a complete psychological collapse. So, the text is warning us that by the time you hear the actual physical gunshot ring out, the true war has already been fought and lost.
It was fought in the realm of information, and the defense failed.
The physical violence is merely the kinetic manifestation of an information ecology that has already suffered total catastrophic collapse.
The sheer weight of that realization is staggering. If dehumanization always precedes the gunshot, then the implications for how we live our lives are profound. It means that stopping dehumanization at the information level by scrubbing our own digital habits, practicing relentless hygiene, learning OSINT, demanding that our media investigate root causes, and fighting for algorithmic transparency, it's not just an exercise in media literacy.
No.
It is literally the act of stopping a physical war before it starts. The primary battlefield of the modern age isn't a physical trench. The battlefield is the glowing screen in your hand long before a single troop is ever mobilized.
It elevates the mundane act of verifying a source or fact-checking an emotionally charged post before you share it. It makes the practice of cognitive security an act of preemptive peacekeeping.
Okay, we have covered a monumental amount of ground today. Let's take a collective breath and summarize the architecture of this text for you, the listener. We started with the biological premise that war requires a diet of lies to survive. We examine how the manipulation of facts and the spread of hate speech function as literal toxins, committing information violence against our shared ecology.
We explored the radical necessity of claiming cognitive security as a fundamental human right to protect the operating systems of our minds.
We detailed the trinity of mental cleanliness, practicing epistemic hygiene to rigorously verify our inputs, semantic hygiene to protect the integrity of our language, and collective sense-making to ensure we are building a consensus reality together.
We looked at the tactical toolkit for ordinary citizens, using open-source intelligence to democratize truth, and pre-bunking to vaccinate our amygdalas against manipulation before the backfire effect can take hold.
We demanded a structural shift toward peace journalism, forcing the media to investigate the systemic root causes of conflict, rather than just profiting off the propaganda of kinetic violence. We dove deep into the machine layer, exposing the mathematical necessity of forcing algorithms to align with human values through independent audits, rather than letting them optimize for outrage.
And we ended with the sobering, terrifying reality that all of this architecture is required because dehumanization is the mandatory precursor to physical slaughter.
It is an incredibly comprehensive, deeply considered framework for survival in the information age. But analyzing this blueprint leaves me with one final provocative question.
Oh, I like where this is going.
It's an avenue of thought that naturally emerges from the mechanics we've discussed. Let's assume we succeed. Imagine a world where we implement total cognitive security on a global scale. We perfect our semantic hygiene. We mandate independent AI audits that successfully filter out all manipulative outrage.
Okay, a perfect system.
Well, we create this pristine, perfectly regulated information ecosystem. The unavoidable question becomes, who holds the power to decide what constitutes a clean fact versus a pollutant?
Right.
If we empower an overarching system, whether it's a council of independent auditors or an aligned superintelligence to aggressively filter out all manipulation, do we risk creating an information ecology that is not just clean, but dangerously sterile? Does the pursuit of absolute cognitive security accidentally become a new, subtle form of top-down authoritarian control, just dressed up in the language of hygiene?
Or consider the alternative. Is true epistemic hygiene naturally self-correcting and immune to tyranny precisely because it relies on decentralized OSINT and grassroots collective sense-making?
Yeah.
Can a truth that is genuinely crowdsourced ever become a tool of oppression?
That is a phenomenal, terrifying question. Where exactly is the boundary line between a healthy, curated ecosystem and a sterilized, controlled one? That tension is something for you to chew on as you navigate the internet this week. Think about your own digital diet. Think about the semantic labels on your cognitive pantry. When you feel that spike of outrage, ask yourself if you are being manipulated by the machine or if you are engaging in true sense-making. Because at the end of the day, when you look at the diagnostic landscape of our modern world, that X-ray machine might be broken and the waters of truth might be incredibly murky. But this text proves we aren't helpless. We have the analytical tools to filter the water. We have the power to demand better architecture from our technology. And we have the collective responsibility to ensure that the process of dehumanization never takes root in our minds. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of truth and the ecology of information. Keep your epistemic hygiene sharp, stay relentlessly curious, and we'll see you next time.